December 1944. An American soldier had 3 days left before the firing squad. His crime wasn't running. It was refusing to use a weapon he knew couldn't stop German tanks. So, on the frozen front during the Battle of the Bulge, he rebuilt his own bazooka and went back to the line anyway. That night, as the Panzers rolled forward, something unexpected happened. Tank after tank started burning, and then the reports suddenly went quiet. What he did saved lives, and the army never wanted it talked about. December 18, 1944, 11:47 p.m. A young American soldier, Private James "Jimmy" Castellano, lay buried in a frozen foxhole near Bastogne, barely 300 yards from German lines. Somewhere behind him, inside a dimly lit command tent, the papers that would end his life were already signed. In 3 days, he was scheduled to face a firing squad, punishment for striking a superior officer. No one there knew that before sunrise, this same condemned soldier would do the impossible. He would cripple the German advance, knock out tank after tank, and change the way American forces thought about anti-armor forever. Yet officially, his name would vanish from the record. The night air had collapsed to 8 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of cold that bit straight into bone. Each breath Jimmy exhaled turned to ice the moment it left his lips. His fingers, shoved into torn wool mittens with the tips cut off, tightened around a weapon that technically wasn't supposed to exist. It was a Frankenstein creation, a bazooka tube, a scavenged site ripped from a wrecked Sherman, and rockets he had secretly re-engineered himself, breaking more than a few army rules in the process. His death sentence wasn't for fear. It was for refusing to stop doing what he believed might actually save lives. And across the white, silent field, he could already hear them coming. The sound reached him first, a deep diesel growl rolling across the frozen night. German armor. The 2nd Panzer Division was sliding into place for the next day's attack. The spear meant to crack the American line wide open and push all the way to the Meuse River. Intelligence said there were roughly 40 tanks out there. Castellano's unit had 6 bazookas, all standard issue. In the last week, those launchers had managed only 2 real penetrations out of 37 shots. Everything else had bounced off German armor like pebbles against a wall. Jimmy glanced down at his pack, counting the modified rockets again. 12 left. He knew he might need every single one. Jimmy Castellano hadn't come from privilege or comfort. He grew up on 9th Street in South Philadelphia, right off the Italian market, in a neighborhood that smelled like bread, diesel, and hot metal. His father owned a small metalworking shop that repaired massive industrial boilers, the kind where a single bad weld could level half a block. In that shop, Jimmy learned everything that mattered: precision under pressure, how to listen to metal, how to measure angles with nothing but instinct, and how to build the tool you need when the right one doesn't exist. By 9, he was cutting steel. By 11, he was welding. And by 16, he could spot a structural weakness from across the room. Jimmy enlisted in April 1943 and was assigned to the 101st Airborne as a combat engineer, not because he loved jumping out of planes. In fact, he was terrified of heights. The Army simply needed men who could handle demolitions and field repairs under fire. He survived training by never allowing himself to look down. Every practice jump left him vomiting into his helmet bag, yet somehow he earned his wings. On D-Day +1, he landed in Normandy with hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his rifle. But the moment bullets started flying, the trembling stopped. His mind and hands became one with the fight. Out in the field, the lessons his father drilled into him took control. Where other engineers struggled with primers and detonators, Jimmy could build and place a shaped charge in under 30 seconds, set it, step back, and know exactly how the metal would fail. His platoon sergeant, a tough West Virginian named Ruskin, summed it up in one line: "Castellano, just don't miss." That reputation kept Jimmy alive in the first month, but it couldn't save the men around him. The real problem was becoming obvious in Normandy, and it grew worse with every battle. The American M1A1 bazooka looked deadly on paper. A 5-foot launcher firing rockets advertised to punch through 4 inches of armor at 200 yards. On paper, the bazooka was supposed to stop any German tank. In reality, it often turned the men carrying it into targets. The first time Jimmy saw it fail was July 12th, in the thick hedgerows south of Corentin. A Panzer IV emerged from the morning fog, turret slowly sweeping toward their position. Private Eddie Kowalski, just 23, from Buffalo, set up exactly the way training manuals showed. Kneeling, loader ready, calm under pressure. The range was about 150 yards. Textbook conditions. Everything should have worked. Kowalski fired. The rocket slammed into the Panzer's glass plate, right on target, erupting in sparks, and did nothing. In an instant, the 75mm gun returned fire, and both Kowalski and his loader were gone. Jimmy was only 15 feet away, close enough to feel the blast and later recover Kowalski's dog tags from the wreckage. The next tragedy came with Sergeant Martinez on September 19th, during Market Garden near Eindhoven. He struck a Tiger tank 3 times, the track, the side of the turret, and the rear deck. Each rocket detonated, but none penetrated. The enemy survived, and his men didn't. The Tiger's turret turned with cold, mechanical precision. 1 round, and Martinez and 4 others in the same foxhole were instantly killed. Castellano was left to dig them out, while Martinez's bazooka lay twisted and smoking in the crater. By December, the numbers told a brutal story. The anti-tank teams had suffered a 73% casualty rate in their first engagement. A soldier with a bazooka lasted, on average, only 4 days in active combat. Rockets either bounced off angled armor, failed to detonate, or ignited without penetrating, especially against the new German tanks with reinforced frontal plating. Army engineering reports blamed the failures on operator error or lack of training. Castellano had read every one of them. He had watched Martinez, trained for 8 months, expert on every range test, die because the weapons simply didn't work. The problem wasn't the men, it was the rockets themselves. On December 15th, 3 days before Bastogne, Castellano found himself at a supply depot outside Mormillan, supposedly resting before the next operation. Instead, he holed up in the ammunition bunker, comparing captured German Panzerfaust warheads to American bazooka rounds. The difference was clear to anyone who really looked. The German-shaped charge was deeper, the cone sharper, and the standoff distance calculated to let the blast form perfectly. American rockets relied on brute force. The Germans relied on geometry and physics. Castellano laid out the numbers, angles, and metallurgical differences to Captain Morrison, but the officer cut him off after barely a minute. "Private, are you an explosives engineer?" "No, sir." "Did you design the M6A3 rocket?" "No, sir, but the penetration angle, the M1A1, is within specification." Conversation over. Despite the dismissal, Castellano knew the problem wasn't theory, it was the rockets themselves. If men were missing their targets, Morrison said, that was a training issue, not a weapons problem. Then he stood up, ended the conversation, and dismissed him. Castellano walked out of the captain's tent, went straight back to the ammunition bunker, and decided that if the army wouldn't fix the rockets, he would. He worked through the night of December 15th and into the cold morning of the 16th, building a solution that was simple on paper and lethal to attempt in practice. Using an entrenching tool, he carefully shaved the interior nose cones of 6 bazooka rounds to deepen the shaped charge, then fashioned a standoff collar from cut sections of German stick grenade handles, wooden rings that would force the warhead to strike exactly 4 inches from the armor, just enough space for the molten copper jet to form properly before it slammed into the steel. The work required absolute precision. Remove too much explosive and the round wouldn't detonate. Remove too little and it wouldn't penetrate. The standoff distance had to be perfect. 3 inches was too close, 5 inches too far, and every fraction mattered. Castellano calculated everything using the metal stress equations his father had drilled into him and comparison measurements from the captured Panzerfausts. There were no tests, no prototypes, no second chances, just math, instinct, and the quiet knowledge that if he was wrong, somebody would die. At 4:30 a.m. on December 16th, Sergeant Ruskin walked into the bunker and found him surrounded by shaved warheads and splinters of wood. "Castellano, what the hell are you doing?" he asked. Castellano didn't look up. "Fixing the bazookas, Sarge." Ruskin lifted one of the altered rockets, turning it slowly in his hands, studying the rough wooden standoff collar. In a glance, he understood both the ingenuity and the danger. "You realize this is a court-martial offense, unauthorized modification of ordnance," he said. "Yes, Sergeant. And if one of these blows early, the man carrying it won't survive." "Yes, Sergeant." Ruskin didn't answer right away. He just stood there, weighing the rocket and the consequences when a low thunder rolled in from the east. Artillery. A lot of it. The offensive had begun. He looked at Castellano, then at the stack of altered rounds, and back again. "How many did you make?" 18. Ruskin exhaled once. "Take 12. Hide the rest." Ruskin told him that if anyone started asking questions, the story was simple. The rounds came from a captured German supply cache. He started for the door, paused, and glanced back. And Castellano, they'd better work. They did. On December 16th, during the first clash outside Foy, Castellano dropped a Panzer IV with one shot at more than 200 yards, the rocket spearing through the glacis and setting off the ammunition inside. The blast tore the tank apart so violently that burning metal rained down nearly 80 yards away. Nearby bazooka teams firing regulation rounds hit nothing, 6 shots and 0 results. When Captain Morrison examined Castellano's gear and discovered the alterations, the color drained from his face, fury replacing disbelief. "Private Castellano, you are under arrest for unauthorized modification of U.S. military ordnance. A serious violation." "Sir, I just destroyed a German tank with one shot." "You endangered every man in this company with that round," Castellano argued, pointing out that their own bazookas had fired 6 times with no effect. Within 20 minutes, Morrison had him in handcuffs. By December 17th, the court-martial papers were signed, execution scheduled for the 21st. The army didn't waste time in wartime. Yet as fate would have it, the German offensive accelerated. Bastogne became encircled, and every able-bodied soldier, including Castellano, was suddenly needed on the line. The army had given Castellano a rifle, shoved him into a foxhole, and told him the firing squad would wait until the Germans were dealt with. He remained still until nightfall, then quietly retrieved his modified bazooka and the remaining rounds that Sergeant Ruskin had hidden. At 11:53 p.m. on December 18th, the first German tank emerged through the treeline, 400 yards to the north. Castellano recognized it by the engine alone, a Panther, likely an OSF. Gee, its gasoline motor producing that high-pitched whine beneath the rumble. Moonlight glinted across the snow, painting the battlefield in eerie silver blue, and the night grew deadly silent. The Panther crept forward with slow, deliberate confidence, its turrets sweeping left and right as it hunted for American positions. Castellano braced the bazooka on his shoulder, the improvised periscope prism he'd wired and taped to the tube, giving him a clearer picture than the standard sights ever could. Through the glass, he picked out every detail. The commander's cupola, the spare track links bolted across the glacis, the tactical numbers stenciled on the turret, 217. Range, roughly 380 yards. Almost no wind, maybe a faint push from the west. The bitter cold meant the rocket motor would burn a little hotter, a little faster. He shifted his aim 6 inches left of center mass and steadied his breath. No one volunteered to serve as his loader. Nobody wanted to help a man already marked for death. So Castellano worked alone. He cracked open the tube, slid the modified rocket inside, the wooden standoff collar clearly visible, then closed the breech and tapped the trigger contacts twice to make sure the circuit was live. The round felt different, heavier than regulation, and the added collar meant the flight could be unstable. It might tumble, strike at an angle, and fail completely, or it might perform exactly the way he'd calculated. Panther 217 kept advancing, now inside 350 yards, its turret slowly swinging toward the American line as Castellano settled in to fire. In another 8 seconds, that 75mm gun would fire, and everyone in Castellano's sector would be gone. He squeezed the trigger. The rocket motor snapped to life with a violent crack, a burst of orange flame lighting the foxhole for a heartbeat before the round leapt into the night. It arced across the frozen field, wobbling slightly, the wooden collar dragging but keeping it true. 2.5 seconds of flight felt like forever, that strange battlefield clarity when time stretches and every heartbeat becomes separate. The rocket slammed into Panther 217's glacis, 18 inches right of the driver's port, and the standoff collar did its job perfectly, holding the warhead 4 inches off the armor so the shaped charge could form. The shaped charge erupted, transforming the explosive into a molten copper jet streaking at over 5,000 feet per second. It tore through 4 inches of face-hardened steel like it was paper, punching into the crew compartment and turning the interior into a furnace. The Panther came to a halt. No massive explosion, no cinematic fireball, just dead silence except for the rising smoke curling from every hatch and viewport. The commander's cupola burst open, revealing bright orange and white flames inside. Nobody emerged. 30 seconds later, the tank's ammunition began cooking off, tiny detonations rattling the hull and igniting even brighter sparks from the open turret. One shot, one kill. 90 seconds later, a second Panther emerged. Castellano's hands moved automatically as he reloaded, the cold forgotten in the focus of the moment. This tank was smarter, using the first Panther's burning hull as cover, advancing in short, calculated bursts. He could see the commander peeking out of the cupola, scanning for the source of the deadly rocket. An experienced tanker, range about 410 yards, near the weapon's effective limit, even with Castellano's modifications. He adjusted for the extra flight time and aimed carefully for the turret ring, where the armor was thinner, praying his calculations held true. The Panther halted, ducking behind a snow drift, only the turret exposed, a tiny, difficult target. Castellano fired. The rocket struck low, hitting the upper glacis instead of the turret ring, but the standoff collar worked perfectly. The molten jet tore through the armor, igniting the engine compartment in flames. The crew abandoned ship, 3 men sprinting back toward German lines. Castellano didn't fire again. His mission was tanks, not men. 2 down. 11 rounds remained. Then the third and fourth Panthers appeared, 50 yards apart, advancing with coordinated precision. One fired suppressing rounds toward the American foxholes, while the other moved steadily forward. Textbook German armored tactics. Castellano targeted the moving Panzer IV, an older model with thinner armor, a much easier kill. He fired. The rocket struck the turret, separating it from the hull and sending it 10 feet into the air as the ammunition detonated. The shockwave toppled 2 nearby German infantrymen. The surviving tank immediately tried to reverse into cover, but Castellano was already reloading. He led the target, aiming where it would be in 3 seconds, and fired again. The rocket struck the engine deck, igniting a fire that, while not catastrophic, spread rapidly. Within 30 seconds, the crew abandoned the vehicle, leaving it burning on the snow-covered battlefield. For tanks destroyed, 8 rounds left. By 1:15 a.m., the German assault had ground to a halt. Castellano could hear the officers shouting in German, their voices carrying across the frozen battlefield. He couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable: confusion, anger, fear. For tanks lost in just 22 minutes to an enemy they couldn't even locate. The American line should have crumbled, but instead, burning German armor blocked the advance. At 1:47 a.m., the attack resumed. This time 6 tanks spread across a 400-yard front, moving in coordinated formation, ready to strike again. Castellano targeted the center vehicle, another Panther, and fired. The rocket struck perfectly in the glassy plate, ripping the front armor inward and detonating the tank like a bomb. 5 enemy tanks remained, but now they knew roughly where he was. 2 turned their turrets toward his position and fired. The 75mm shells roared overhead like freight trains, the pressure waves rattling the foxhole. They were bracketing him, closing in with each salvo. He reloaded quickly, picked a Panzer IV on the left flank, and fired, destroying it. With his remaining rounds, he sprinted down a communication trench toward a secondary position 80 yards south, ready for the next strike. German machine gun fire traced bright green lines through the darkness as Castellano moved, diving into his new foxhole just as tank rounds detonated where he had stood 15 seconds earlier. 6 tanks down, 6 rounds remaining, and the German assault pressed on through the night. Infantry, armor, and artillery all committed. The breakthrough had to succeed before dawn, or the operation would fail. Castellano moved 3 more times, setting up, firing, and relocating before return fire could reach him. Each shot found its mark. A Panther at 2:33 a.m., a Panzer IV at 3:18 a.m., another Panther at 4:02 a.m. 9 tanks destroyed, 3 rounds left. At 4:47 a.m., with dawn creeping over the horizon, the Germans launched their final push. 3 Tigers moving in line formation, the heaviest armor they had. Castellano had never faced a Tiger before. 8 inches of frontal plating meant to repel anything short of a naval gun. His modified rounds might penetrate, or they might bounce off like all the others. He aimed for the first Tiger's turret ring, the weakest point he could see, and fired. The rocket struck, punched through, and detonated inside the turret. The Tiger froze, smoke billowing from every opening. The crew refused to abandon it, firing the bow machine gun until a secondary explosion finally silenced it. 2 rounds left. 2 Tigers still advancing. The second Tiger loomed 450 yards away, right at the edge of Castellano's effective range. He aimed high to account for the drop and fired, watching the rocket arc through the pre-dawn gloom. It struck the engine deck, punching through the thinner rear armor, and the tank erupted in a massive fuel explosion, sending the turret cartwheeling end over end through the air. 1 round remained. The final Tiger had halted, its commander visible in the cupola, binoculars sweeping the American line for him. The tank's 88mm gun turned slowly, methodical, and deadly. At this distance, 1 shot would obliterate everything within 30 yards. Castellano slid his final modified round into the tube. His hands were so numb he could barely feel them, and the wooden standoff collar was chipped from the chaos of the fight, maybe weakened, maybe dangerous. The rocket could tumble, fail, or explode in his face. He steadied himself anyway and aimed for the glassy plate, the same shot that had worked on the first Panther 12 kills earlier. Slow breath, smooth trigger. The rocket streaked out, flying true, and struck dead center. The shaped charge punched through the Tiger's armor, tore through the driver's compartment, and drove straight into the ammunition storage. The explosion ripped through the frozen ground with such force it carved a secondary crater, sending debris raining for nearly a full minute. 14 tanks destroyed. 0 rounds remaining. Castellano slumped in his foxhole, the bazooka tube beside him, hands trembling from cold and exhaustion. Across the field, the German assault had crumbled. Surviving infantry were retreating, abandoning burning vehicles and wrecked equipment. At 5:30 a.m., as the first gray light of dawn crept across the horizon, Sergeant Ruskin found him. Castellano, what the __ did you do? Castellano, shaking, answered simply, Counted 14, Sarge. Ruskin's eyes swept over the field of smoldering tanks, then back at the man who had done it alone. 14 tanks. 1 soldier. Modified rockets you built in a supply bunker. Yes, Sergeant. The court-martial papers were still on Morrison's desk. I know. Ruskin sank into the foxhole, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. They're going to have to tear those papers up now. You can't execute the man who just saved Bastogne. But Ruskin was wrong. By 9 a.m., every bazooka team in the 101st Airborne had heard of Castellano's night. By noon, soldiers from other companies were arriving at his position, eager to see the modified rounds, to understand how he'd done it. Castellano patiently demonstrated the shaved explosive cone, the wooden standoff collar, and the precise measurements that had turned a desperate gamble into battlefield genius. Within 24 hours, men all across Bastogne were carving and rebuilding their own bazooka rounds, huddled in foxholes and shattered buildings, working with entrenching tools and whatever scraps they could find. There were no orders, no diagrams, no engineers, only rough sketches in the snow and whispered instructions passed from man to man. Cut the cone like this. Add 4 inches of standoff. Aim for the glassy plate. By the time Captain Morrison noticed the pattern, the results were impossible to ignore. Between December 18th and December 20th, bazooka kill rates had surged from 9% to 61%, punching through armor that was supposed to be untouchable. When he finally ordered an inspection of the ammunition stocks, the truth stunned him. Nearly 70% of the division's bazooka rounds had been modified. When Morrison tried to confiscate the altered rounds, 3 company commanders flatly refused. The modifications worked, and the men were not surrendering something that kept them alive. Forced to escalate, Morrison reported the situation to Division Command, and an investigation team arrived on December 22nd. They examined Castellano's original rounds, took samples, and filed a report that would take 11 days to crawl its way to Ordnance Engineering Headquarters. By the time it arrived, the idea had already escaped containment. Modified bazooka tactics had jumped to the 82nd Airborne, the 10th Armored, and 3 infantry divisions, spreading across France, Luxembourg, and even into Germany itself. The German response came on Christmas Day. An intercepted transmission from Panzer Lehr Division headquarters broadcast to every armor commander on the line. American anti-tank effectiveness skyrocketed overnight. Orders flooded German lines. Engage bazookas only from maximum range. Avoid close combat. And report any modified enemy tactics immediately. Panzer doctrine shifted almost instantly. Tanks that had once pushed forward aggressively now hesitated. Commanders who had grown confident in their armor suddenly faced a weapon capable of punching through it at range. The psychological impact was undeniable. American infantry reported German tanks withdrawing from key positions, refusing to advance into towns, and increasing their standoff distance by 300 yards. What had been invulnerability was now caution, a direct result of Castellano's night of ingenuity. In late December, Luftwaffe intelligence officer Hayman Becker surveyed the wreckage of destroyed Panthers near Bastogne. Among the debris, he spotted the wooden standoff collars and instantly understood their purpose, filing a report that warned Berlin. American forces had solved the shaped charge penetration problem. The report arrived on January 3, 1945, but by then, the lesson had already spread too far. The U.S. Army responded in 2 phases. First, on January 8, the Ordnance Department issued Technical Bulletin 417, explicitly banning field modifications of bazooka ammunition and threatening court-martial for any soldier caught. Yet approximately 90% of combat units ignored the order, having already seen the results firsthand. Second, on January 19th, a team of engineers from Aberdeen Proving Ground arrived in Belgium, carrying 17 modified bazooka rounds collected from frontline units, and they began live-fire tests against captured German armor. The results simply confirmed what every exhausted infantryman already knew. The improvised rounds achieved roughly an 80 to 94% penetration rate against Panther frontal armor, compared to just 14% for standard ammunition. The engineers filed a formal recommendation that the Army adopt Castellano's modifications for mass production, but the document disappeared into the bureaucracy, sitting on desks for 6 weeks while committees debated liability concerns, safety protocols, and the cost of retooling factories. On March 4, 1945, the improved M6A1 rocket entered production, featuring a factory-built standoff collar and deeper-shaped charge, a direct mass-produced version of Castellano's foxhole innovation. Official technical bulletins credited extensive engineering analysis and testing for the advancement, but Private James Castellano's name appeared nowhere. As for the court-martial, the papers lingered on Captain Morrison's desk until January 15th, when he was rotated stateside. His replacement, Captain Derriggs, reviewed Castellano's service record, now adorned with a bronze star for his extraordinary actions on December 18th, and quietly closed the case of the unauthorized modification. Captain Derriggs quietly dropped the charges. Castellano learned 3 days later when Sergeant Ruskin told him he was no longer facing execution. "That's it?" Castellano asked. "That's it," Ruskin replied. No apology, no recognition, just quietly resolved. "What about the modifications? Are they still using them?" Ruskin pulled a modified bazooka round from his pack. "Every squad has them now." Private James Castellano survived the war, though he was wounded twice more, shrapnel in France, frostbite in Germany, and was discharged in November 1945 as a corporal. He returned to Philadelphia, took over his father's metalworking shop, and spent the next 43 years repairing industrial boilers, the quiet hero behind a battlefield revolution. He married Catherine, who worked at the Navy Yard, raised 3 children, and rarely spoke of the war unless asked directly. Castellano attended only 2 reunions of the 101st Airborne, in 1958 and 1973. Yet wherever he went, veterans approached him, men he had never met, sharing stories of using his modified bazookas across Germany, Italy, and even the Pacific, where his innovations had spread with remarkable speed. He would listen politely, deflect the attention, and steer the conversation toward family instead. It wasn't until 1987 that military historian Dr. Patricia Wolfe unearthed the December 1944 Ordnance Investigation reports, revealing the full scope of his hidden impact on anti-tank warfare. Dr. Wolfe uncovered a glaring discrepancy, a dramatic surge in bazooka effectiveness during the Battle of the Bulge, with no official explanation. Following the paper trail, she traced it to Bastogne, poring over 101st Airborne records and Sergeant Ruskin's after-action reports, which noted a Private Castellano single-handedly destroying 14 enemy tanks outside Bastogne on the night of December 18th to 19th. Her investigation led her to Philadelphia, where she found Castellano running the same metalworking shop his father had opened in 1923. She interviewed him for 6 hours, recording every detail, and in 1989 published her groundbreaking findings in the Journal of Military History, finally documenting the story of a soldier whose battlefield innovation had quietly reshaped anti-tank warfare. The article concluded that Castellano's modified bazooka rounds were responsible for destroying an estimated 817 German tanks between December 1944 and May 1945, likely saving 2,000 to 3,000 American lives. Castellano read the article once, tucked it into a drawer, and never spoke of it publicly. He passed away in 1994 at age 71 from complications of emphysema. His obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer spanned 4 paragraphs. The third noted his Bronze Star from World War II, but it made no mention of the 14 tanks, the improvised rockets, or the revolutionary anti-armor tactics that had quietly reshaped American battlefield strategy. This is how battlefield innovation truly happens. not in committee rooms or engineering offices analyzing data, but in frozen foxholes, through the hands of a welder from South Philadelphia who watches his comrades die, understands why their weapons fail, and improvises a solution with entrenching tools and scavenged wood while facing execution. Official histories credit systematic engineering improvements, but the reality was one man refusing to accept that death was inevitable, risking everything to solve a problem experts said was impossible, and returning to a working-class life without ever claiming the recognition he had unquestionably earned. James Castellano's battlefield innovations saved thousands of lives. The Army adopted his design, erased his name from official records, and moved on. He returned to repairing boilers, raised his family, and passed away in quiet obscurity. Yet every American tank-killing round fired after December 1944 carried his invention forward. Every German panzer destroyed by a shaped charge with the correct standoff distance was a testament to his calculations, a silent proof that one man's ingenuity had forever changed the course of anti-tank warfare. The soldiers who fired those rounds never knew his name, yet they carried his innovation into every battle until victory was won. That is true legacy, not medals, not official recognition, not a name in history books, but impact that echoes forward, saving lives long after you're gone. If this story of quiet courage resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to follow more untold histories of ordinary men achieving extraordinary feats. Leave a comment sharing where you're watching from and which World War II stories you want us to uncover next.